I am Maria Brann. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at West Virginia University, and my primary research interest is in patient disclosures, confidential disclosures of patient information.
All right. So Maria, in your research in looking at how patients disclose or other people disclose personal information about the patient, what is the biggest communication issue there?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is that what I've seen in my research and other research has looked at all these negative consequences that occur when healthcare providers freely give information and freely share this information with third parties. And I think one of the biggest ethical issues in terms of our communication is knowing what's going to happen with that information. So people are given this information, what ultimately then ends up happening with that. And we see all the negative in the news and all these bad things. And in my own research, I even looked at some of the negative consequences, how this affects employment or trust with the healthcare provider. And then ultimately, patients don't disclose information to their healthcare providers because they fear that those healthcare providers are going to disclose that information to other people. And so then it breaks down that communication that needs to exist so that the patients can then ultimately get better, have better relationships, be healthier. But one thing that I'm starting to look at now is because all the healthcare providers tell me, I know what I'm doing. I'm looking out for the best interest of my patients, you know, and even if that means I have to violate the HIPAA laws, which so many of us heard about, you know, that we get those all the time when we go to the doctor's office. They give you those pamphlets saying we're protecting your privacy. They know that they're violating these laws, but they don't care. Right? They say, because I know how to take care of my patient and I'm doing what's best for them. So where I'm kind of going now is exploring, well, maybe it's not as bad as we think it is. You know, I mean, we've seen all the negative, and so what could possibly be good about disclosing information? And so I think what's really interesting, and I was a little surprised by this, because I really, not that I'm, you know, always negative, but I was really thinking, this is so bad, we shouldn't be doing this. It's really not that bad. And so healthcare providers really are looking out for the best interest of the patient. And patients think that healthcare providers are looking out for the best interest. And so they're okay with them disclosing information to certain people.
Hey, right? Let me stop you for a second and just ask, what kind of personal information are we really talking about here?
A lot of times it's diagnoses, prognosis, treatment options. They're giving them information that they may or may not have been aware of. Particularly what I've been looking at recently is how they communicate with people who accompany a patient to a healthcare setting. And oftentimes it's a relative, but we don't always know that. So sometimes it could be a friend, sometimes it's just the person who drove them to the clinic, which has no, you know, stake in, you know, this outcome or whatever. But you know, they're giving them this information of, you know, about the patient, about, you know, what's wrong with them, how they want them to get healthier, what they want them to do, and they often communicate with, I say relatives, but, you know, friends as well, about how they can then help the patient comply with what they want them to do. And so there's this idea that we have to look at this patient in the context of their family and their friends, you know, because they're also going to help them reach the goal that the healthcare provider has set for them. One thing that I do think is interesting that might then have some of that negative implication is, where does the patient fit in all this? You know, because everyone thinks that they're entitled to this information. Everyone that I communicate with, you know, the relatives thought that, the patients thought that, the healthcare providers thought, if you're there, you should get that information. And they all had positive motives, you know, and they all thought everyone else had positive motives. But I thought what was interesting is the patients often fell out of the equation, which I think is very negative. At least we're very autonomous individuals in our culture, and so we want to have the right to decide for ourselves, you know, what's going to happen. And so that's one thing that's still potentially negative, is because even though healthcare providers have admitted, you know, I'll talk with the relatives of the patient. You know, I start communicating with them, and they never said they ignore the patient, but I wonder what happens to this patient now, because they freely talked about how, you know, the healthcare provider and the relatives are now this team looking out for this patient. Right? But we don't really know what's the patient? Are they just now becoming this passive person who's going to do what they tell them to do? Or, you know, so I see some definitely implications for the communication that now occurs with, especially if the patient feels like they're kind of being left out of this equation.
Well, if the patient is being left out of the equation, can you just give me 2 or 3 principles or pointers that when you are a patient that you should be aware of? And the releasing or the disclosure of personal information?
Well, what was interesting when I've spoken with patients, like I said, they all expected this was going to happen. But again, they thought it was very positive. So I think that patients need to be their own advocates first and foremost. While they recognize that everyone else seem to be advocates for them, they need to be their own advocates. So we hear these tips all the time, going in and being honest with your healthcare provider. You have to trust your healthcare provider and be honest with them. Simple things like tell them what you want, what you expect out of this. So, if you're bringing someone with them, I expect that you'll share this information with this person in the company so that they can help me make decisions. Or simply, this person has brought me here, but when we communicate about what's going on, when we talk about what's going on, I really prefer that you just only address me. Maybe we ask someone else to step out of the room, that type of thing. So I think that the best thing that patients need to do is, we have to be assertive, and we have to recognize that we need to take care of ourselves. And these people are here to help us, but we also have to decide who we want helping us and what we want from them.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.